Today, we're going to talk about the Trump campaign's closing messages and how they've botched it with some fatal missteps, some of my closing thoughts about the election, and my interview with the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wickler, about how things are looking in the country's most watched state. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen, and you're listening to No Lie. Well, this is the last episode before Tuesday's election. If you've been watching Donald Trump, you'd see that his final message to voters is that we're rounding the corner and coronavirus is on its way out.
Now it's 99.8%. I mean, you look at what's going on, and we're rounding the turn, we're rounding the corner, we're rounding the corner beautifully.
You have Don Jr. claiming that deaths are basically negligible at this point.
Give me a break, Laura. The reality is this. If you look, I put it up on my Instagram a couple days ago because I went through the CDC data because I kept hearing about new infections. But I was like, well, why aren't they talking about deaths? Oh, because the number is almost nothing. Because we've gotten control of this thing. We understand how it works.
You have Mark Meadows throwing in the towel altogether on the virus.
So here's what we have to do. We're not going to control the pandemic. We are going to control the fact that we get vaccines, therapeutics, and other mitigation.
Why aren't we going to get control of the pandemic?
Because it is a contagious virus.
And of course, you've got Tucker Carlson, who wants you to know that he definitely had some documents that were going to turn this election on its head and sink Joe Biden's candidacy. And well, then this happened.
So on Monday of this week, we received from a source a collection of confidential documents related to the Biden family. We believe those documents are authentic, they're real, and they're damning. At the time we received them, my executive producer, Justin Wells, and I were in Los Angeles preparing to interview Tony Bobolinsky about the Biden's business dealings in China, Ukraine, and other countries. So we texted a producer in New York, and we asked him to send those documents to us in LA, and he did that. So Monday afternoon of this week, he shipped those documents overnight to California with a large national carrier, a brand name company that we've used, you've used countless times with never a single problem. But the Biden documents never arrived in Los Angeles. Tuesday morning, we received word from the shipping company that our package had been opened and the contents were missing. The documents had disappeared. Those documents have vanished. As of tonight, the company has no idea and no working theory even about what happened to this trove of materials, documents that are directly relevant to the presidential campaign just 6 days from now. We spoke to executives at that company a few hours ago. They seemed baffled and deeply bothered by this, and so are we.
Okay, I think that's enough disinformation for one episode. Now, in reality, while Trump says that we're rounding the corner, I think he might be overlooking the fact that we're not so much rounding the corner as we are completely mired at the worst point of this outbreak that we've ever had. The United States just hit 100,000 new cases in one day, which is a record. The only way this is rounding the corner is if the other end of the corner is a cliff. While Don Jr. says that deaths are at, quote, almost nothing, what he seems to overlook is that we're still losing 1,000 people a day. On the day that he said this, October 29th, we lost 1,004 Americans. I wonder what those families would say if you told them that as far as Don Jr. is concerned, their son or daughter or mom or dad or grandparent's life was negligible, didn't even count. And even beyond that, nothing quite like hearing Don Jr. pretend that 1,000 dead Americans a day and 230,000 dead Americans in total is no big deal on the same network that milked 4 deaths in Benghazi for literal years. I guess dead Americans don't count when the president's a Republican. With regard to Mark Meadows, credit where it's due, at least he was honest when he said that they're not bothering to try to contain this virus anymore. But the dishonest part was the suggestion that they ever were. The only steps that Trump seems content to take was a half-baked travel ban to China on January 31st. And since then, he spent the last 9 months pretending that that did the trick. Even with nearly 250,000 dead Americans, 8% unemployment, 11 million jobs lost, the guy is still throwing himself a mission accomplished parade and pointing to the travel ban. Nothing like touting a solution to a problem that was never actually solved. And finally, when it comes to Tucker Carlson's grand finale about the quote-unquote laptop from hell, this story that some devastating documents got lost in the mail was exactly the amount of pathetic that this whole sham deserves. It was a laughable excuse to try and replicate the last email scandal in 2016, only it never held water. It made the people who tried to make it happen look like even more of a joke than they already were, and frankly, it took time away from what could have been a way stronger closing argument by Trump and Republicans. But because this is what the GOP has devolved into, this Fox News fever dream where Democrats are wrapped up in secret scandals funded by George Soros and billions of dollars are being exchanged so that the deep state can order dossiers. And don't forget Uranium One and Pizzagate and Fusion GPS and Tony Bobulinski and Burisma. They get so wrapped up in this tinfoil hat bullshit that they lost the rest of the country. But they'll never admit that. So I guess we just have to take their excuse for it, which is that somewhere in the United States are documents that will finally expose Hunter Biden. But for now, we'll never know because they were lost in the mail. If you ever wondered what a grown-ass man would sound like giving the equivalent of "the dog ate my homework," now you've heard it. And look, I can go on with the nonsense that came out of the Trump campaign this week, but I think you get the point. And that is that this is what you get from the right. This is the culmination of 4 years of overt gaslighting and the shameless peddling of disinformation and just outright conspiracy theories. And this is a trend that will only continue, considering this is what the Republican Party has devolved into. This is what their president spews. It's what their senators and lawmakers spew. It's what their news outlets spew. Trump's terrible, but he's also a symptom of a much larger disease that's overtaken the GOP. There's one way to fix it, and that is for Trump to lose by so much, to be so thoroughly repudiated that his brand of republicanism is just too toxic to even touch. But I think the best way to talk about the future is to go back to the past. A big part of Republicans' votes in 2016 was that there was a difference between what offended them and what affected them. And so while Trump, while he cursed, while he bragged about sexual assault, while he spewed misogyny and xenophobia and racism, while it was offensive, it didn't affect the people who voted for him. But what I hope that those people understand now is the extent to which another 4 years of Donald Trump will not just offend people, but will affect them. And I'm talking about the 20 million Americans who will lose their health coverage when Trump dismantles the ACA, or the 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions who lose their guarantee of coverage, or those 26 and younger who rely on the ACA to stay on their parents' plans. I'm talking about the countless women who rely on the ruling of Roe for access to safe abortions in this country. The women in Kentucky and Mississippi and Missouri and North Dakota, South Dakota, and West Virginia, all of which have only one abortion clinic left in the state. I'm talking about undocumented immigrants brought here as children, people who've had families here and whose lives are here, only to be sent back to a country of origin that they never knew. Families torn apart for no reason other than cruelty. I'm talking about a member of the LGBT community whose right to marry their partner is in jeopardy because of a Supreme Court that's now hostile to Obergefell. I'm talking about voting rights for people like those who waited 11 hours to vote in Georgia because of voter suppression efforts. The same efforts that demonstrators were beaten over while marching from Selma to Montgomery 55 years ago. I'm talking about anyone living in a blue state that may be unfortunate enough to need disaster relief after a wildfire or a hurricane or a tornado destroys everything they have. And they're left begging hat in hand to a guy who only considers electoral benefit when making decisions. So if you're fortunate enough not to be personally affected by Trump's draconian policies, I'd ask that you consider the people who are, because there are a lot of them. And for those people, it may very well be the difference between life and death. There's a moment that I think about a lot, a moment from Elijah Cummings during the Michael Cohen testimony. And he said, "When we're dancing with the angels, the question will be asked, what did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? Did we stand on the sidelines and do nothing?" I think back to middle school and high school, and we learn about World War II and the Nazis, and the question that always comes up is not just how could the Nazis have done what they did, but how did the people of Germany let it happen? The implication being that that could never happen here. Until you see a con man pilfering American tax dollars win over the party of fiscal responsibility, a sexual predator hiding behind the Bible that he's never cracked open, winning over evangelicals, who saw his rise to power on the promise of erecting walls to keep brown people out and banning Muslims from entering and eliminating protections for LGBT students and cutting food programs to hungry seniors. And then you realize not only could it happen here, but it's happening here. This is how it starts. This is the beginning. And if you say it, if you try to warn people, you sound hysterical up until the point where it's too late, because then kids are locked in cages and ripped away from their moms and dads, and suddenly it's normalized. And trans Americans have been expelled from the military, and suddenly it's normalized. Peaceful protesters are being tear gassed, and suddenly it's normalized. Immigrants are being sent back to the countries they escaped from, where they'll die, and suddenly it's normalized. And a deadly pathogen is being personally spread by the very government officials who failed to contain it at rallies to celebrate the leadership of those very people. And it's normalized. It's here. We're at the precipice. But the beauty of that, the silver lining here, is that there's so much we can do. We have agency here. We have the power. If we didn't, they wouldn't be working so damn hard to take our right to vote away or to convince us that we can't make a difference. The truth is that we have the power to elect officials who care about fixing our government, starting with H.R. 1, expanding the right to vote and protecting it from foreign influence, rebalancing the Supreme Court and bringing about justices who actually represent the will of the American people, adding Puerto Rico and DC as states and giving the voiceless a voice, expanding healthcare and making sure people aren't needlessly sick in the richest country on the face of the earth, codifying Roe so that all women can choose what they do with their own bodies, enacting a livable minimum wage, strengthening unions so that workers take back power and restore dignity in their work, ushering in sweeping climate change legislation so we can achieve net zero carbon emissions, and ending subsidies for fossil fuels, and ultimately doing away with them forever and transitioning to fully renewable energy. Addressing police brutality so that people of color don't have to live in fear of dying at the hands of those who are charged with protecting them. These things are not pipe dreams. They are days away from being inevitable. The only variable here is us. It's whether we turn out. We have all the power here. So keep the pressure on and help however you can. Because in 10, 20, 30 years from now, when the next generation of kids is sitting in history class and reading about what happened after 2016, the question those kids are going to ask is the same one posed by Elijah Cummings. What did we do to make sure we kept our democracy intact? So now's our chance to ensure that we have a good answer. Now, one last time, I have to mention that we're not done yet. We need help getting Democratic turnout up in Florida, specifically Miami-Dade, Pennsylvania, and North Carolina. We need volunteers to fill shifts to reach voters in these areas, specifically those in communities of color. So please go to votesaveamerica.com and at the top of the page, click on Find Out How You Can Volunteer Now. I'll put a link in the post description. Besides that, if you haven't yet voted, make sure you have a plan to vote. And make sure that plan involves bringing at least one person who didn't vote last time, whether it's a family member or a friend or a neighbor. Make sure the seniors in your life have a ride to the polls. And the same goes for the 18-year-olds in your life too. We're in the home stretch, so make this time count. And thank you for staying engaged, thank you for staying energized, and thank you for fighting for the future of this country. The passion we see now is the best reminder that we've got that this is worth fighting for. To listen to my interview with the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Ben Wickler, check out the interviews playlist on my YouTube channel. That's it for this episode. Talk to you next time.